The hallway smells of floor wax and something sharper underneath antiseptic, the particular cold bite of a hospital at 5 in the morning. You are standing in it, very still, holding a chart that belongs to a patient you have already memorized. The fluorescent lights hum above you at a frequency you have long since stopped hearing. Your white coat is pressed. Your name badge reads Doctor, and then your name, and you have looked at that badge so many times since the day it was made that the letters have lost their shape, become pure fact, become something so ordinary and so hard-won that you keep it almost like a talisman close to your chest, the weight of it reminding you of what it took. You passed your boards, you completed your residency at a hospital that, when you first arrived, had no women's locker room, and so gave you a broom closet with a hook on the back of the door. You are a physician. You have known this for years. And yet this morning, as on many mornings, you will round on your patients and write your orders and speak to families and make decisions that determine what happens next to a human body, and at the end of the pay period, you will be handed an envelope containing roughly half of what your colleague in the next office earned for the same hours, the same nights, the same decisions made in the same fluorescent light. This is America in the 1950s. This is a decade of gleaming surfaces and organized silence. This is a world in which women became physicians anyway, despite the advertisements suggesting they belonged in kitchens, despite the admissions offices that capped them at 5% of each class, despite the county medical societies that blackballed them from membership, and therefore from hospital privileges, and therefore from the ability to admit their own patients to their own wards. They became physicians in spite of all of it, and the country allowed this, quietly, with conditions. Settle in now. The night is long and the story is longer. Let the world outside go soft at the edges. There is nothing out there that requires your attention. There is only this hallway, this particular smell, this particular silence of a building full of sleeping patients and one doctor who is just beginning her day. In 1950, women made up roughly 6% of all physicians in the United States. 6%. It is a number small enough to feel like an accident, and yet behind it are thousands of individual decisions. Women who sat in admissions offices and were asked whether they were serious, women who were warned about wasting a spot that could go to a man with a family to support, women who graduated and found that the profession they had trained for had built its structures entirely around their exclusion, and would require of them a constant daily negotiation just to stand inside the door. You are one of them. Or rather, tonight you will inhabit what their days felt like from the inside, the physical texture of their working lives, the particular exhaustion they carried, that was not only about long hours, but about the sustained effort of being present in a space that communicated, in 100 small and large ways, that they had not entirely been expected to arrive. The 1950s are a decade that exists in American memory as something polished and resolved. The war won, the economy booming, the suburbs spreading outward in neat rows of nearly identical houses. The television tells stories about families where the father earns the living and the mother keeps the house and everyone is reasonably satisfied. And there is truth in that image, partial truth, the truth of a certain class and a certain set of choices and a certain determined willingness to believe that the arrangement is natural rather than constructed. But hospitals in that decade were not the television image. Hospitals were places of genuine emergency and genuine knowledge, and the women who worked in them had fought through systems of exclusion that the television image preferred not to examine. They had gone to medical school in small numbers, admitted because some schools needed tuition and a small number of women could pay it, or because a few institutions had committed themselves to something like equality, or simply because the gatekeepers had not managed to hold the door quite shut enough. They had completed residencies that assigned them the least desirable rotations, the least desirable cases, the patients nobody else wanted. They had emerged into a profession where the hospital committees that granted privileges were composed entirely of men, where the medical societies that conferred professional standing were clubs that had voted against admitting women in some jurisdictions well into the 1950s themselves, and then they practiced medicine. They saw patients. They made diagnoses. They worked nights and weekends, and the specific kind of holiday shift that comes when everyone else has families to go home to, and you have demonstrated a willingness to stay. They were, by every objective measure, physicians. And the envelope at the end of the pay period said something else, said it quietly, said it in numbers on a page, said it in a language that required no explanation because everyone already understood the terms. If you enjoy listening to stories like this, quiet histories of lives that deserve more room than they were given, subscribe. I put a new story out each week, and there will be more like this one waiting for you. Tonight we will move through this world slowly. There is no urgency here. The story does not rush. We will find the detail in the texture of a particular morning, in the weight of a particular instrument, in the face of a patient who looked up and saw a woman in a white coat and felt something shift in the room that neither of them would have quite been able to name. We will stay close to what it felt like to be inside this life, the satisfactions of it, which were real, and the losses of it, which were also real, and the particular kind of strength it required, which was its own kind of knowledge. It begins in a room with wooden chairs and a window that looks out onto a courtyard where nothing is happening. You have been waiting for 40 minutes. This is not unusual. The man who will interview you has 3 more candidates after you, and his secretary has made this known by the particular way she did not look up when you came in and gave your name. The chairs are dark oak, worn at the armrests where the many hands of many waiting people have left their impression in the wood. The waiting room has a particular smell, floor wax and old paper, and the faint metallic quality of the radiator doing its work in the corner. The radiator ticks steadily. Outside the courtyard window, a bird lands briefly on the stone ledge and departs. The year is 1946, or 1948, or 1950. The specific year matters less than the shape of the moment, which repeats itself across a decade with remarkable consistency. You have a degree in biology or chemistry. You have scores that should have made this interview a formality. You are wearing your best dress, and your hands are folded in your lap, and you are trying to decide whether to sit with perfect stillness or whether perfect stillness reads as anxiety. And it might be better to appear relaxed, which requires its own kind of effort. The dress is blue or grey, something quiet. You did not wear red. You thought about what the colour would communicate before you chose it. You have been preparing for this interview since before you knew what an interview was, since the understanding came to you, gradually or suddenly depending on how you remember it, that medicine was what you wanted. Some women who pursued medicine in this era cite a specific moment of clarity: the illness of a parent, the presence of a physician in a crisis, the particular quality of certainty that occasionally arrives in childhood and does not depart. Others describe a longer accumulation, a series of interests and aptitudes and experiences that pointed consistently in one direction. The specific origin matters less than the fact of the wanting, which in your case has been long and steady and has survived the many occasions on which it has been tested. The door opens. The man behind the desk is in his 50s, silver at the temples, the kind of face that has made a great many decisions and does not find the process troubling. He has the comfortable authority of someone who has occupied this chair for years, for whom the interview is a routine rather than an event. He gestures toward the chair across from him. You sit. The chair is slightly lower than you expected, a small architectural detail of the power arrangement in the room that you note and set aside. He looks at your file. He looks at you. He looks at the file again, and this small pause, this 3-second movement of his eyes from paper to person, contains inside it a whole architecture of expectation that you have already learned to read. He is adjusting. The file said one thing and the person in front of him is another thing, and he is making the reconciliation. You have seen this adjustment in enough faces to be familiar with its phases. He will ask you why you want to be a doctor. This is a question he asks everyone, but when he asks it of you, there is a second question folded inside it, which is, why you, specifically a woman, when there are men who also want this, and who will have families to support, and who will not, presumably, leave the profession to have children, which is the concern that is almost always circling the conversation even when it is not the conversation itself. The children question is rarely asked directly in 1950, because asking it directly would require acknowledging that it is being considered, and the consideration of it is not officially part of the admissions criteria, and the gap between what is officially criteria and what actually determines outcomes is one of the more well-understood gaps in the world of institutional decision-making. You have prepared your answer. You have been preparing it, in some form, since the moment you decided that this was what you wanted, since the morning at 14, when your grandmother was ill, and the doctor came and you watched what he did and understood, with the specific clarity that sometimes comes in childhood and does not leave, that this was the kind of knowledge you wanted to have. You have refined the answer through years of telling it to people who are deciding something about your future, and it is true, and it is also strategic. And you hold both of these things at once without difficulty because you have been holding both of them for a long time. The answer you give is about service and knowledge, and the specific impulse that brought you to the sciences and then to medicine. You do not mention the grandmother in the way it actually happened as an event, as a specific morning, as a body that needed help and a man who provided it, and a child who watched. You have found that personal narratives in this context are read as emotional rather than intellectual, and that the distinction is used against you in a way it is not used against your male counterparts, who are permitted to be emotional about their motivations without having their emotionality cited as evidence of unsuitability. So you describe the impulse, in general terms. The description is accurate. The framing is strategic. Both things are true simultaneously. He writes something in the file. You cannot see what. The pen scratches and stops. He asks a follow-up question about your undergraduate performance in organic chemistry, which was excellent, and you discuss it with the directness of someone who is comfortable with the material. He asks about your plan for residency, which is a question with a particular intent, whether you have thought through the practical logistics, whether you understand what you are signing on for, and you answer it correctly, demonstrating that you have thought through the logistics in more detail than most applicants of either gender, because you have had to think through more of them. Some schools will say yes. Harvard Medical School will not admit women at all until 1945, and even after that the numbers remain deliberately constrained. Many schools operate an informal quota, 5%, sometimes less arrived at through no particular policy document, but understood by everyone in the admissions office as the natural ceiling. The reasoning, when it surfaces, runs to variations on a theme. Women take spots from more deserving men. Women leave the profession. The wards will be disrupted. The male students will be distracted. The patients will be confused. These arguments are not presented as prejudice. They are presented as practical considerations, and the distinction matters to the people making them, who believe it, who have organized their understanding of the world in a way that makes the distinction feel real. The Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania has been producing physicians since 1850. In any year of the 1950s, a woman applying to that institution does not sit in this kind of waiting room. She sits in a different waiting room, one in which her presence does not require adjustment, one in which the radiator's ticking is just the radiator's ticking, rather than part of a scene that is being assessed. 100 years of women physicians walked through that institution's doors before you were born, and the weight of that history is different from the weight of this chair, this waiting room, this man with the file. But perhaps you applied to 14 programs and one of them, for reasons having to do with enrollment numbers and budget projections more than enlightenment, decided that this particular year they can take 2 women in a class of 80. You take the seat. You are grateful for it. You are also, in some quiet register of your awareness, already measuring the distance between where you are sitting and where you will be permitted to go, and the measuring has become so habitual that you do it without any particular feeling attached to it. It is simply information, the kind of information you need to navigate accurately. The admissions officer asks his question. You give your answer. The room holds its particular silence for a moment, the silence of a decision being made or deferred. Outside in the courtyard, nothing continues to happen. The wooden chair is hard against the backs of your knees. The radiator has gone quiet. A door somewhere down the corridor opens and closes. You are, in this moment, already a physician in everything except the paperwork. You simply have not been granted the paperwork yet, and the granting of it will take time and will cost something that does not appear on any bill. Medical school, when you get there, will be its own education in the art of being present without being fully welcome. The cadaver lab on the first day, the moment when the professor makes a joke that requires you to not react with practiced ease, not to flinch, not to look offended, not to laugh too hard either, because any of these reactions will be read as the wrong kind of femininity or the wrong kind of toughness, and what is required of you in these rooms is a narrow path between performances that you have not been given a map to. You find it by watching and adjusting, the way you have always found things. The study groups form organically from the men who live in the same dormitory from which you are excluded. This is not a conspiracy, it is geography, and geography produces the intimacy of shared hallways and shared meals and the late-night conversations in dormitory rooms, where study notes become friendships and friendships become the professional networks that will matter for the next 40 years. You are not in those rooms. You study in the library, which is open to everyone, and with the one or two other women in the program, and with the occasional man who makes a deliberate and slightly self-conscious point of including you. The resulting network is smaller and less robust, and the difference compounds over a career. The professor who calls on you with slightly more frequency and slightly more difficulty than he calls on the men is testing something he could not name. If asked to name it some question about whether your presence is stable, whether you will hold up under the particular pressure he is applying, whether you are the kind of woman who will make the argument that she belongs here every day through the quality of her answers. You answer correctly and precisely and without visible distress, which is the correct response. It costs you something. You file the cost alongside the other costs in the same internal cabinet, noting the accumulation. There is a quality of attention that develops under these conditions, a particular alertness, a capacity for tracking multiple registers of a room simultaneously. You listen to the lecture and you also listen to the temperature of the room, the way your presence affects it, the small adjustments everyone makes to accommodate or resist you. You become expert at reading the gap between what is said and what is meant, between the official explanation and the actual mechanism. You develop a sensitivity to the moment when someone is deciding whether you belong here, because that moment happens frequently, and because responding to it correctly makes the difference between getting what you need and not getting it. The examination results come back. You are near the top of your class. This is not surprising to you. It is, to some of your professors, mildly inconvenient, because it disrupts a narrative that is easier to maintain in the absence of contradicting evidence. You note their adjustment to this information. One of them, the professor who called on you most frequently, encounters you in the hall after the scores are posted and tells you, with a warmth that was not quite available before the scores, that you had a very strong performance. You receive this as the information it is that the standard has been assessed and met, that the assessment was done carefully, and the meeting of the standard is now acknowledged, and you continue down the hall to the library, where you have an afternoon of study planned. By the time you reach the last year of medical school, you have been shaped by the institution, and you have shaped yourself in response to the institution, and the two processes are so intertwined that you cannot always tell which is which. You know medicine. You know it thoroughly. You know it the way people know things they have pursued, with the specific determination that comes from wanting something that required wanting badly enough to fight for. The knowledge sits in you like ballast, heavy and stabilizing, and you are about to need it, because the next door, the one that opens onto residency, is going to be even narrower than the last one. Let the admissions office recede now. Let the wooden chair and the silver-templed man and the courtyard windows soften and blur. You got through that room. The radiator has gone cold. The bird on the stone ledge is long gone. You have gathered what you came for and you have moved on, which is what you do, which is what this life requires of you, which is in fact a form of practice, the practice of moving through rooms that were not quite built for you, without losing your momentum or your sense of where you are going. The hospital where you do your residency is a large institution, with 6 floors and a basement that smells of steam pipes and something medicinal that no one has been able to fully trace. The building was built in the 1920s, when the assumption of who would walk its corridors was firmly established, and its infrastructure reflects that assumption in small ways that accumulate one locker room for male residents, a broom closet that has been converted by the addition of a hook on the back of the door for women. The conversion was made recently. The hook is still shiny. Your room, if you have a room which is not guaranteed, because some residency programs in this era simply do not house women, because the housing was built for men, and the assumption of women was so recent that the infrastructure has not caught up. Your room is small and faces an air shaft and contains a narrow bed and a metal locker and a desk with a lamp that has a pull chain. The pull chain has been wrapped in a piece of tape at some point by a previous occupant to give it more surface to grasp. The thoughtfulness of this small modification, left by someone you will never meet, is the most intimate thing in the room. You will sleep in this room approximately 4 hours per night during your first year. This is not a figure of speech. Residency in the 1950s involves call schedules that would be illegal under current labour standards. that are not currently legal standards because the current legal standards do not yet exist, that everyone around you treats as simply the nature of the thing, the price of admission, the initiation that separates the committed from the casual. Your male colleagues in adjacent rooms sleep the same 4 hours and share the same call schedule, and the fatigue is equal in that sense. What is not equal is the expectation that precedes the fatigue. They were told they would be exhausted, and it would make them doctors. You were told you would probably leave. You are not casual. You have never been casual. Casual was not an option that was available to you at the stage when casualness would have been relaxing, when the choice of medicine was still new, and the consequences of that choice were still being assessed by the people whose assessment would determine whether you got to make it. Casual is what you are permitted to be when your place in the room is not itself the thing you are constantly demonstrating. You have not yet been in that room. Your program director is a man named something like Henderson or Hartwell. The name matters less than the posture, the slight perpendicular tilt of the shoulders when he addresses you, as though he is always about to turn away and has not quite decided yet. He treats you correctly. This is important to note, because correct treatment is not given, it is chosen, and he has chosen it. And you are aware of the choice in the same way you are aware of most things, clearly and without drama. He is a man who has made a decision about how to behave toward you, and is behaving that way consistently, and the consistency is a form of professional courtesy that you receive as the gift it is, however small. He has also assigned you the clinic rotation, not the surgery rotation you listed as your primary interest. The clinic, specifically the Women's Health Clinic, which deals in gynecology and obstetrics, and the particular category of problems that women bring to hospitals, problems that male physicians in this era frequently find less interesting than they find the diseases that affect bodies regardless of sex. This assignment is not presented as punishment. It is presented as logical. You are a woman, the patients are women. There is a natural fit here that everyone around you seems to find self-evident. The argument has a surface coherence that makes it difficult to contest without seeming to argue against the evident logic of it, which is part of what makes it so durable as an arrangement. You do the rotation, you become very good at it, because you become very good at everything you are assigned to, because becoming very good is the strategy you have, and it has served you this far. The women who come to your clinic are sometimes relieved to find a woman waiting for them. They tell you things they might not have told the man before you, not necessarily more dramatic things, but more precisely reported things, described in the specific language of someone who is not adjusting the description for an audience she is uncertain of. They relax in the examination room in a way that is slightly different, and you can measure that difference in how long it takes them to answer your questions accurately, in the quality of the history you are able to collect. You file this information. You use it. It is real clinical knowledge, even if the channel by which you arrived at it was not the channel you would have chosen. The clinic runs 6 days a week. Tuesday through Saturday are scheduled appointments. Sunday is walk-in hours for women who cannot take time away from their other obligations during the week, who have children at home and jobs that will not accommodate weekday appointments, and who therefore arrive on Sundays with the tired purposefulness of people who have finally gotten to the item on the list that they have been putting off. You cover Sunday. This is also not presented as a punishment. It is presented as a natural division of the schedule, arrived at by the logic of available coverage. You note the logic. You work Sundays. But you also notice, and this is something you carry quietly, without discussing it, because there is no one to discuss it with who would not misunderstand you. Notice that you are almost never in the room when the interesting cases are being worked up by the senior residents. You arrive sometimes to find that a diagnostic puzzle you had been tracking has been resolved in a meeting you were not told about. You find that the informal teaching that happens after rounds, the conversations in the hallway or at the coffee cart, where cases are talked through in the particular free-form way that constitutes much of residency education. These conversations frequently happen when you have already gone back to the clinic, or to the call room, or to the broom closet with the hook on the door. A woman named Dr. Esther Lovejoy, who had done all of this a generation before you, wrote about it in terms that you would recognize. The slow accumulation of small exclusions that adds up to a different education, not in the curriculum but in the texture. The man beside you in residency is learning the same diseases you are learning, but he is also learning something else, the casual belonging, the assumption that the room is his, the ease of moving through institutional space without measuring every step. This is its own kind of knowledge, and it has professional consequences that extend far beyond the residency years into the career structure and the referral networks and the committee appointments and the publication records. It is not available to you. You are learning the diseases and you are learning the friction, and both will mark you. What is available to you is everything else. You work. In the particular silence of the overnight call room at 3 a.m, with the pull-chain lamp casting its low circle of light on the desk, you study. You read the journals that arrived that week, and you review the cases from earlier in the day, and you work through the diagnostic questions that the day's patients raised but did not answer. You develop, over months of this, a relationship with the late night that is not exactly comfortable, but is productive in the specific way of quiet and without interruption. The fatigue becomes the background against which the work happens. You work inside it rather than against it. In the clinic, you develop a diagnostic precision that comes from seeing a very large number of patients with a very specific set of presentations, which is in fact how diagnostic precision works through volume and attention, and the willingness to look carefully at what is in front of you. The clinic patients come with a range of conditions, and within the range you begin to see patterns, the patterns of how certain symptoms cluster, of what questions reveal what the symptom list initially conceals, of the gap between what a patient says first and what she means, which is not deception, but the ordinary difficulty of translating internal experience into medical language without a medical education to draw on. You become, without being entirely sure when it happened, very good at this. Very good at the intake, at the history, at the physical examination in the particular conditions of a clinic that is busy and under-resourced and populated with patients who have often waited a long time and who are tired. Very good at the decision-making that the clinic requires, quick but not careless, efficient but attentive, the particular calibration between thoroughness and speed that clinic medicine demands and that you cannot learn except by practicing it under the conditions that require it. The other residents know this. Most of them are decent people, and decency in this context means something specific. They do not actively impede you. They lend you their notes. They tell you when an interesting case is being presented, or most of them do most of the time, which is imperfect but better than nothing. One of them, a man from Ohio with large hands and a careful manner, occasionally waits for you outside the conference room to walk in together, which is a small kindness that costs him nothing obvious, and that you accept without making anything of it, because making something of small kindnesses was not something you were taught to do and you never learnt it independently. The kindness is noted. It is not elevated above what it is. This is the correct response. There is a senior resident in your second year whose name you will remember for the rest of your life, not because he was especially cruel, but because he was the one who said, plainly, to your face, what everyone else was managing to communicate through the architecture of the schedule and the structure of the assignments, that he found your presence disruptive. Not personally, professionally. He felt that the female residents required accommodations that strained the system, and that the straining was unfair to the men who had chosen this path without requiring special consideration. He said this in the hallway, on a Thursday afternoon, in a tone that suggested he was identifying a problem rather than expressing a preference. The identifying of problems is the most comfortable way to express a preference that would be difficult to defend if expressed directly. You look at him for a moment. The moment is longer than is strictly comfortable. You then say, very quietly, that you are not aware of having requested any special consideration, and that you would appreciate being informed if he identifies one in the future, because you would certainly want to correct it. He looks away first. The hallway is empty, except for the two of you. The moment resolves into the next moment, which is both of you continuing down the corridor in the same direction, in silence, until the corridor divides and you go left, and he goes right. This is a minor victory, and you do not permit yourself to treat it as more than it is, because minor victories are only useful if you save the significance for something that has more weight. You will need significance later. You spend it carefully. The senior resident is still in the building. You will work alongside him for another year. The correct tone for the remainder of that year is professional and sufficient, and without the trace of the hallway in it, because carrying the hallway into the work would cost you more than he cost you, and the cost management of this life is something you have been doing for a long time. The residency ends. You have learned medicine. You have learned it more thoroughly and under more friction than most of the men who went through the same program in the same years, not because you are more gifted, but because friction produces a particular kind of attention that ease does not require. You have learned it in the clinic and in the call room and in the hallways, and in the early mornings when the pull chain lamp was still on and the air shaft outside the window was grey with coming light. You have learned it alongside people who ranged from actively hostile to actively kind, with most of the range falling in the wide middle territory of not particularly interested in your experience, one way or the other. What you have is what you have, and it is considerable. The broom closet with the hook is behind you. The long corridor of the residency years is behind you. What is ahead is the office, and the ward, and the patients, and the envelope, and the filing cabinet, and the slow work of building a practice in the spaces the institution is willing to provide. It is sufficient. You are, at the end of the residency, more prepared than you knew. You would be prepared not only in the technical sense, but in the deeper set of having been tested in ways you did not choose, and having found that the testing did not break you. Sleep now, if you are ready. The residency years are behind you. The next room is yours, small and at the end of a hallway and facing a brick wall, and completely, unambiguously yours. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The pay envelope arrives on the last Friday of the month. It is a plain manila envelope, letter-sized, your name typed on the front. You have been a practicing physician for 2 years now, affiliated with a hospital that granted you privileges after a committee meeting you were not present at, and whose outcome you learned from a letter that was courteous and brief. You have office hours on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and a clinic affiliation on Wednesdays, and hospital rounds on the other days, and a call schedule that runs every third night. And you have not, in 2 years of this, taken a single day off that was not covered by a colleague. You open the envelope at your desk, after the last patient has left, in the particular quiet of an office that smells of antiseptic, and the faint sweetness of the hand cream you keep in the top drawer, because the constant hand washing chaps your skin raw. The figure on the check is familiar by now. It has not changed significantly from last month or the month before. You know what it says before you read it. What you also know, because you are a careful person who pays attention to information that is available, is that your colleague in the office next door, a man who completed his residency at the same time you did, who sees a comparable number of patients, who covers the same hospital call schedule, earns roughly twice what this envelope contains. You know this not because he has told you, which he has not and would not, but because in small institutional settings information moves through the spaces between official channels, through the particular way that secretaries sometimes speak to one another, and the way that billing records are occasionally visible to more people than they are intended for. The American Medical Women's Association has been documenting this differential for years. Their surveys, conducted with the particular methodological care of people who know their findings will be challenged, show a pay gap that is consistent and significant, and that does not disappear when you control for specialty, hours, or seniority. Women physicians in the 1950s earn, on average, between 40 and 60% of what their male colleagues earn for equivalent work. The range reflects genuine variation. Some women in some specialties at some institutions are paid closer to parity, but the average is the average, and it says something that is not ambiguous. The official explanations, when they surface, are variations on a small set of themes. Women physicians see fewer patients because they spend more time per consultation. This is sometimes true and sometimes cited as a deficiency, when it is in fact a clinical choice with clinical consequences, when patient satisfaction scores would later vindicate it as an approach, when the women themselves understood it as the kind of medicine they had trained to practice. Women physicians choose lower-paying specialties, pediatrics, internal medicine, psychiatry rather than surgery, which is higher compensated. This is also sometimes true, and the question of whether this choice reflects genuine preference or reflects the fact that surgery programs actively discourage women from applying is a question that the official explanations prefer not to pursue. There is also the matter of the hospital committee. The hospital committee sets compensation. The hospital committee is composed of men. The men on the hospital committee know each other in the particular way that people know each other when they have eaten dinner in the same places and gone to the same schools and attended the same professional events without having to Arrange any of it specially. The women physicians are not in these rooms. They are not in the dining clubs. They are not at the golf courses or the sports events or the particular informal contexts in which compensation decisions are sometimes made, or at least softened into their final form before they appear in any official document. You fold the check and put it in your bag. You will deposit it Monday morning. It will cover your rent and your office expenses and the cost of the medical journals you subscribe to, because staying current is not optional in this profession. And the hospital library closes at 6, and you often need access. At 7, it will not leave much. What you earn is enough to live on. This is a fact you are aware of. It is not the same fact as earning what your work is worth, but you know the difference between the two, and you know which one is adjustable and which one is not. At this moment, in this institutional structure, in this particular year, you have chosen to stay because the work is the work. It is what you trained for, what you are good at, what gives the days their shape and their meaning. The envelope is one piece of information. It is not the only piece. Across the country, in the same month, the same envelope is being opened by thousands of women physicians. In hospitals and private offices and clinics, women who have done everything the profession required are sitting with documents that say, in quiet numerical terms, that what they have done is valued at a specific rate, and that rate is not the rate at which their male colleagues are valued, and the difference is not explained by the difference in their credentials or their hours or their outcomes. It is explained by the fact of who they are, which is a fact the medical profession has not yet found a way to address, and in most cases has not yet found the language to name. Some of them will write letters. Some of them will raise the issue at professional meetings where it will be acknowledged with a seriousness that does not quite produce action. Some of them will simply continue practicing, accumulating a body of work that makes the differential harder and harder to maintain as anything other than what it is. The American Medical Women's Association, founded in 1915, has been arguing for equality in compensation and training and hospital privileges since before most of these women were in medical school. The argument is patient and persistent, and largely correct, and largely unheeded, and the women who make it understand this and make it anyway. You drive home through streets that are dark by 5 in November. The radio in your car, a 1949 Ford that you bought used and have maintained yourself because the mechanic near your office tends toward an assumption about what women understand about cars that is not accurate in your case. The radio is playing something you are not really listening to. You are thinking about a patient you saw this afternoon, a woman of 43 with a presentation that does not quite resolve into any of the obvious categories, and the thinking is pleasurable in the specific way that diagnostic puzzles are pleasurable. They have a shape, they have an answer somewhere inside them, and the finding of the answer is a thing you are good at. By the time you pull into your parking space, the envelope is not what you are thinking about. This is the particular mercy of work that matters. It crowds out the smaller grievances. It does not resolve them. It simply makes them, in this moment, less immediate than the patient who needs your attention, which is to say, it makes them less immediate than almost everything. The apartment is on the 3rd floor. The radiator knocks. There is a dinner you will make from whatever is in the refrigerator, and then a chart you will review, and then sleep, which will be deep because the days are long and the body eventually insists. Tomorrow is a clinic day. Saturday is a clinic day. Sunday you will cover 2 calls and be home by evening, and read the journals that arrived this week, and go to bed at a reasonable hour, and on Monday the envelope will be there again. The work continues. This is its own kind of answer to the envelope, not a sufficient answer, not the answer the situation requires, but the answer that is available right now, in this apartment, in this November, in this particular life you have built from the materials the world was willing to provide. The ward at 7 in the morning has a specific quality of light that comes from the tall windows at the east end, pale and thin, winter light or early autumn light, the kind that arrives at an angle and illuminates the dust in the air without warming anything. The beds are arranged in 2 rows down a long room, 16 beds, patients in various stages of wakefulness, the overnight nurses in the final hour of their shift, moving with the particular economy of people who have learned to do everything in the smallest number of steps. You have a clipboard. You have memorized most of what is on it before you arrived, because you reviewed the overnight notes before coming to the ward, because arriving already informed is the difference between rounding efficiently and rounding the way someone who has only just read the chart rounds. The distinction matters to your patients. It also matters to your colleagues, who are watching, always watching, not with malice, but with the particular attentiveness of people who are deciding, on an ongoing basis, whether you belong here. Bed 3 is a woman of 61, admitted 2 days ago, with chest pain that has resolved, and a cardiac workup that is inconclusive, in the specific way that cardiac workups sometimes are in women, where the presentation differs from the textbook description, in ways the textbook was written before enough women had been included in the studies to document. You know this. You know it from the papers and from your own observation, and from a conversation you had at a professional meeting 3 years ago with another woman physician who had been tracking the differential in symptom presentation for a decade, and who had findings that were not yet published because she could not get them published because the journals did not find the subject as interesting as she did. The woman in bed 3 looks at you when you stop at her bedside. She looks at you the way some patients look at you, with a flicker of surprise that settles into something else, relief perhaps, or simply the adjustment that comes from expectation being different from reality. Many of your patients have not had a female physician before. Some of them are visibly pleased. Some of them ask, politely, whether there is also a male doctor they could see, and you handle this without making it anything more than a clinical question, routing them to a colleague when that is what they want, and continuing with the patients who are satisfied with you, which is most of them, and which, over time, becomes simply the distribution of a practice. The woman in bed 3 tells you her chest still feels tight when she breathes deeply. This is information she has apparently not told the overnight resident, or told him in terms that did not make it into the note, and you write it down, and you change the plan for her morning, and you make a note to speak to the resident about documentation that is complete enough to be useful. You do this without emphasis. The correction is clinical, not personal, and framing it correctly is part of the work. Down the ward, in bed 9, is a man who asked your name when you introduced yourself, and then asked how long you had been a nurse. This has happened before. It happens with some frequency, in fact, not as often as the mythology suggests, but often enough to constitute a recognizable event in the workday. You tell him your name and your title and the name of the senior attending you are rounding under this week, and by the end of the sentence his face has settled into something that is not quite acceptance and is not quite resistance, something more like neutrality, which is sufficient for the clinical relationship you need to have with him. He is 54, post-operative from an appendectomy 3 days ago, recovering without complication, ready to go home tomorrow if the infection markers continue to decline. You review his chart. You answer his questions. By the end of your visit, he is calling you doctor, not because you insisted, but because the clinical exchange has established the relevant category and the category has sorted itself. Most patients do this. Most people, presented with competence in a context where competence is what they need, will eventually organize their understanding around the competence rather than around the expectation they arrived with. The ward has its rhythms, and you have learned them so thoroughly that you move through them without thinking the sequence of the chart review, the order of the beds, the timing of when the attending will arrive, and what he will ask, and how you will present the cases in the compressed, precise format that attending rounds require. You have become fluent in the language of this institution, and fluency, in any context, is its own kind of belonging. There is a moment that happens sometimes on the ward, and it is difficult to describe without making it sound more dramatic than it is, which is not dramatic at all, which is in fact very quiet. It happens when a patient is frightened and you sit down, which some physicians do not do, because sitting communicates that you have time when time is actually scarce, and you have learned to calibrate the appearance of time available to the severity of what is needed, and you explain what is happening and what will happen next, and the patient's face does something. The specific thing it does is different each time, but it is always a movement from one state to another, from not knowing to knowing, from frightened to something that is not quite calm, but is adjacent to calm, the state in which a person can receive information and make decisions and move forward through what is happening to them. This is what you trained for. Not the envelope, not the committee meetings, not the question of whether you belong in the room this moment. This specific exchange of knowledge between two people in which one of them needs what the other one has. Everything else is the context in which this moment either happens or doesn't. You have arranged your life so that it happens as often as possible. By the time you finish rounds, the light has changed. The thin morning light has been replaced by something fuller, the kind that makes the ward feel less institutional and more simply like a room where people are resting. The overnight nurses have gone home. The day nurses are moving through their routines with the particular efficiency of the first hour of a shift when everything is still organized and the complications of the day have not yet arrived. You have 4 patients to follow up with before the afternoon clinic. You have notes to write and phone calls to return and a consultation request from the surgery department that arrived this morning and that you will respond to before lunch. The day has shape. The shape is familiar. Inside the familiar shape, there is always something unexpected, always one case that opens onto something you have not seen before or seen in this combination before, and the opening is one of the things that makes the days worth continuing. The ward smells of breakfast. Now the cart has come through with trays of oatmeal and wheat coffee and toast, and the smell is warm and slightly institutional, and not unpleasant. A patient in bed 12 is laughing at something on the radio. The sound travels down the ward and dissolves before it reaches the end. This too is part of it, the sound of a patient well enough to laugh, which is not nothing, which is in fact the whole point, arrived at after all the other things that had to happen first. The letter arrives on a Tuesday. It is on heavy cream stock, with the society's seal embossed at the top, a caduceus, 2 serpents twined around a staff in the ancient representation of medicine that every physician recognizes and that has its own particular meaning in this context, in this envelope, on this particular Tuesday. The letter is politely written. It declines your application for membership. The County Medical Society is not a casual organisation. Membership in it is, in practical terms, a professional necessity. Many hospitals in the 1950s grant operating privileges only to physicians who are members of their local medical society. Insurance panels use society membership as a criterion. The professional network that constitutes much of how medicine actually functions, the referrals, the consultations, the informal conversations in which specialists advise one another and patients are matched to the right care this network runs through the society, through the dinner meetings and the committee appointments and the corridors of an organisation that has, for most of its history, considered its membership self-evidently male. In some states and in some counties, the exclusion of women from medical societies persists well into the 1950s. In others, it has technically been resolved women are nominally eligible, but the practice of sponsorship required for membership means that an applicant needs existing members to vouch for her, and the existing members are all men, and the men are sponsoring the people they know, which are the people they went to school with and trained with and have dinner with. And the loop closes in a way that produces an all-male membership without requiring any specific rule to that effect. You have been told, by a physician you trust, that your application was discussed at the last meeting, that there was not a vote against you specifically, but a general agreement that the timing was not right, that the membership was not yet comfortable, that perhaps next year the climate would be different. These are phrases that have been used about women in medicine since the 1880s. The climate, perpetually, is almost but not quite ready. You read the letter twice, then you put it in the filing cabinet under M, which stands for both medical society and the category you have been developing for several years of things that are wrong and that you do not have time to be continuously angry about, because the anger takes energy that you need for the work. This is not indifference. The filing cabinet is full. You look at it sometimes and you know exactly what it contains. Doctor. Frances Conley would say, decades later, that the women of her generation had been forced to choose between fighting the system and practicing medicine, and that most of them had chosen to practice medicine because that was why they had become physicians. This framing is both true and not entirely true. They practiced medicine. They also fought not in the dramatic way that makes good stories, but in the patient and persistent way of people who write letters and attend meetings and request conversations and file applications that are declined and then file them again. The American Medical Women's Association existed for this purpose. It had been fighting these fights for 40 years when the women of the 1950s arrived, and it would keep fighting them for 40 more. The hospital privileges question is the most immediately practical consequence of the society exclusion. If you cannot admit your own patients, you are dependent on a male colleague to admit them on your behalf, which means his name appears on the admission, his relationship to the patient becomes the official one, the structural one, and your relationship is informal, dependent on his cooperation, legally invisible in the way that informal arrangements become legally invisible when something goes wrong. You have managed this through a colleague named Dr. Marcus Whitfield, who is a decent man and who admits your patience without making it anything more than it is. But decent men are not always available, and the structural problem is not solved by individual decency. You apply again the following year. You know that you will, and you apply, and the letter on the heavy cream stock comes again, and you put it in the filing cabinet, and you continue. This is not resignation. Resignation would feel different, softer, more resolved. What this feels like is patience, which is different from resignation in the same way that a closed fist is different from an open palm. Both are quiet. They do not mean the same thing. The society eventually admits women. In some counties this happens in the 1950s, in others the 1960s, in a few, later than anyone would subsequently be comfortable acknowledging. The mechanism of the change is not usually a dramatic confrontation. It is the accumulation of applications and letters and professional meetings at which women physicians stand and make the argument, calmly and correctly, and go home and come back the following year and make it again. The argument does not change, because the argument is correct, and the facts supporting it do not change. What changes, eventually, is the room listening to the argument. On the afternoon after the second letter arrives, you have a patient who is 28 years old and frightened and pregnant with her first child, and who has been referred to you by a midwife who recognized something in the presentation that suggested the pregnancy needed monitoring beyond what she was equipped to provide. You sit with this patient for 40 minutes. You answer her questions. You make a plan that she understands and that she is, by the end of the appointment, cautiously reassured by. She leaves knowing what will happen next. The letter is in the filing cabinet. The patient is going home with a plan that will keep her and her baby safer. You have made one small correction to one small corner of the world, and the correction is permanent in the way that all medical outcomes are permanent. It happened, and what happened as a result of it will continue to happen, and the society with its seal embossed in cream stock does not have anything to do with whether the intervention was correct. The clinical competence and the institutional exclusion exist in parallel, and you have become practiced at holding both of them without letting one obscure the other. The exclusion is real. The competence is also real. You are not going to stop practicing medicine because you cannot attend the dinners, and you are not going to stop noticing the exclusion because the medicine is satisfying. You are going to do both, which is what you have been doing, which is what the filing cabinet documents. The third application, you will submit it eventually, because the act of submitting is itself a kind of statement, a refusal to accept the exclusion as permanent, a declaration that you intend to be here next year and the year after, and that you expect, eventually, to be received. The third application will be different, not because you will have changed your qualifications, which are already more than sufficient, but because something in the room will have shifted, some small increment in the direction of things becoming what they should have been, and the shift will have been produced in part by the patient persistence of women who filed applications into filing cabinets and came back anyway. For now, the filing cabinet closes. The afternoon light is on the floor in strips between the blinds. The office is quiet. You are already thinking about tomorrow's schedule, the cases you will see, the particular problem in bed 3 that still does not quite resolve. The society and its letter are not the most interesting thing in the room. They never were. The office you have been given is at the end of the hallway, past the supply room and around a corner that makes it slightly difficult to find. This is not, you understand, intentional. The office that was available when you joined the practice was this one, because the other offices had been filled in the order that the physicians had arrived, and you arrived after the others, and the order produced this result. The result is, nonetheless, the result. The office is small. It has one window that faces the side of the building next door, a brick wall that receives about 2 hours of direct light in the afternoon. You have put a plant on the windowsill that manages, improbably, to survive on this ration. You have put your diplomas on the wall, medical school, the board certification, the residency completion certificate, not out of vanity, but out of a practical understanding that patients who are uncertain about you will be reassured by documents, and that certainty among your patients is a clinical value, not merely an aesthetic one. The diplomas, you have noticed, are read more carefully in your office than they are in the offices of your male colleagues. You have seen patients' eyes move to the wall when they first sit down, making a rapid assessment that the diplomas are designed to answer. This is not insulting. It is information about what patients in this era have learned to expect from a physician's office, and about where you sit in relation to that expectation, and about the gap between where you sit and where you will eventually not need to sit, which is somewhere in the future that has not arrived yet, but toward which things are incrementally moving. The Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania has been producing physicians since 1850. Elizabeth Blackwell received her medical degree from Geneva Medical College in 1849. Sophia Jex Blake fought for the right to medical education in Edinburgh in the 1870s. There is a long history here, longer than the current configuration of resistance would suggest, and you are somewhere in the middle of it, practicing medicine in an office at the end of a hallway that is small and faces a brick wall and is yours. Your patients find you. This is perhaps the most sustaining fact of the working day, that they find you. Navigate to the end of the hallway, sit down in the wooden chair across from your desk, and then tell you what is wrong. Some of them have come specifically to see a woman physician. Women who have experienced the particular kind of care that some male physicians of this era provide, care that is efficient and technically correct, and that treats the patient's body as a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be heard. Some of these women have sought you out because they heard from someone else that you sit down, that you take time, that you do not dismiss what you cannot immediately explain. This reputation has built itself over years without your explicitly cultivating it, through the specific mechanism of patients talking to other patients, which is the oldest referral system in medicine and which has no official standing and which works. Women tell each other where to go. They tell their sisters and their neighbours and the women they see at church, and the network that forms is informal and undocumented and completely effective, and it fills your schedule in a way that the official referral channels, from which you are partially excluded by the society membership question, might not have done. A patient this week, a woman of 52 with a cough that has persisted for 6 weeks, and a husband who told her it was nothing, sits across from you and answers your questions with the slightly cautious quality of someone who has been told before that what she is noticing is not significant. You listen to her lungs. You order an X-ray. You tell her the cough is worth investigating, that 6 weeks is long enough to warrant a closer look, and something in her face shifts. The particular shift of being taken seriously, of having observation confirmed as valid, which is a form of medicine that does not appear in the textbooks but that functions in the body in ways that the textbooks are only beginning to document. The X-ray will show something you will want to investigate further. The further investigation will lead, through the specific sequence of tests that good medicine requires, to a finding, and the finding will lead to a treatment, and the treatment will extend this woman's life by years. This is not metaphor. This is what medicine does when it is practiced, with the patience to sit down and the thoroughness to follow the thread. You cannot know this in the moment. Sitting across from her while she describes the cough, the future is not visible from the present in this way. But you can do the thing that makes the future available to her, which is to take the cough seriously and begin the investigation. The office at the end of the hallway is where this happens. Not in the large offices with the windows that face the street, not in the committee meetings or the society dinners, not in the informal corridors of institutional power. Here, in this room, in this specific exchange between a physician who has the knowledge and a patient who needs it. The brick wall outside the window is lit in the afternoon in a way that is almost warm. The plant on the sill has produced a new leaf since last week. The cough is being taken seriously. You see 12 patients on a good day, 14 on a busy one. Each appointment is 30 minutes, which is longer than the appointments in some practices and shorter than what you would sometimes prefer, but it is what the schedule allows, while also maintaining the thoroughness that the clinical work requires. You do not rush patients out. You have developed a kind of efficiency that does not feel rushed, that produces movement through a consultation without the movement feeling like a pressure, and this is its own clinical skill, not listed in any curriculum, learned through the specific experience of sitting with a great many people who needed their time to feel sufficient. The afternoons have a particular quality in this office. The light changes, the phone calls arrive in clusters. The last patients of the day are sometimes the ones who have been gathering their resolve all week to come in and tell you the thing they have not told anyone. These are the appointments that stay with you, that you turn over in your mind on the drive home, that are still there when you wake up the next morning. They are not the whole of the work, but they are the part of the work that makes you understand, in a way that is more than intellectual, why you are here. The diplomas on the wall are real. The degrees were earned. The brick wall outside is warming in the afternoon light. Somewhere in the hospital, the woman from bed 3 is sitting up, eating her lunch. Somewhere in the future, the woman with the cough is going to have years she would not otherwise have had. The office at the end of the hallway is exactly where you are supposed to be. Let the office hold you for a moment. The small window, the afternoon light, the plant with its new leaf. The world outside does not require anything of you right now. Rest inside this particular room, which is small and yours and sufficient. They give you the worst cases. This is not something that is explicitly stated in any policy document or discussed in any meeting you have been invited to attend. It is simply the way the patient panel assembles itself through the distribution of new admissions, through the routing of referrals, through the quiet direction of patients who are difficult or poor or who speak languages. The clinic prefers not to accommodate to the physician who is available and who will take them. The worst cases, in the hospital parlance of the 1950s, means something specific. It means the patients nobody else wants to spend extended time with. The patients who are poor and cannot pay. The patients who are complicated, medically complicated, which is interesting, or socially complicated, which is exhausting in ways that are not clinical. The patients who are immigrants, whose English is uncertain, whose families are large and present and asking many questions. The patients with mental illness alongside their physical illness. The patients who are elderly and alone. The patients whose prognosis is poor and who therefore offer the attending physician the experience of watching something go wrong over an extended period without the satisfaction of watching it go right. You take them. You take them not because you have been told you must. The assignment is never made that boldly, but because the alternative is to turn them away, and turning them away is not something your particular understanding of medicine permits. They are patients. They need a physician. You are a physician. The logic, however inconvenient for your schedule, is not especially complicated. Mrs. Antonelli is 78 and was brought in by her daughter, who does not speak much English, and her son, who speaks more but has been working double shifts at the factory, and who sits in your examination room with his hat held in, both hands turning it slowly. And Mrs. Antonelli has chest pain and ankle swelling, and a heart that sounds, through your stethoscope, like something that has been working very hard for a very long time. You have the interpreter service on the phone, which takes 20 minutes to arrange, and which has a sound quality that makes nuance difficult, and you work through the history slowly and carefully because the history is the most important thing you have, because the physical examination and the diagnostic tests will only tell you what you already suspect, and what you suspect is a heart in late-stage failure that has been managing on compensation and will not be managing much longer. The son translates what he can. His mother watches your face. She is not frightened, or she is frightened in a way that is so familiar to her that it looks like equanimity from the outside. She has lived through things. You can see this in the way she receives information with a stillness that has been earned rather than assumed. You tell her, through the phone and the sun and the slow movement of intention through language, what is happening and what can be done and what cannot be changed. She nods. She asks one question. The son translates it. She wants to know if she will be able to go home. You tell her, yes. That is the most honest answer you can give. Yes, you will go home. Though how long home will continue to be available to her is a question the heart will answer at its own pace. You make a plan for managing the failure, for reducing the fluid, for monitoring the function, for making the remaining time as comfortable as the condition allows. The son writes down everything. His mother watches your face the whole time and you let her, because being watched while you work is not something you have found distracting for a long time. The difficult cases are also, frequently, the interesting ones. The poor patient who has been managing a condition without medication for years develops adaptations that the well-medicated patient does not develop, and the adaptations tell you things about the underlying physiology that the textbook version of the disease does not tell you. The immigrant patient who grew up with a different diet and a different pattern of movement develops risk factors at different rates, and the different rates are information if you are paying attention. The elderly patient who has outlived the statistical expectation of her condition by decades is a mystery worth investigating, and the investigation sometimes yields something worth knowing. You have, over years of receiving the difficult patients, accumulated a clinical knowledge base that is different in character from the knowledge base of a physician who has seen mostly the standard presentations. You know what complicated looks like from the inside. You know what poverty does to a body over decades. You know how to take a history in circumstances where the history is difficult to obtain. You know, which perhaps matters most, how to sit with someone whose situation cannot be fixed and remain present and useful rather than withdrawing into the procedural distance that fixability sometimes permits. This knowledge was not assigned to you. It was given to you through the assignment of patience nobody else wanted, which is a form of giving that does not intend itself as a gift, but the knowledge is real. It sits in you now as accumulated experience, as pattern recognition, as the specific and unteachable familiarity with the edge cases that the mainstream of the clinical literature takes longer to notice. Mrs. Antonelli is admitted. Her daughter stays the first night in the chair beside the bed, which is not technically permitted but which you have not found a reason to address. In the morning, the daughter is still there, awake, reading a small book in the particular light of the early ward. Mrs. Antonelli is sleeping, her breathing slow but steadier than it was last night. The medication is working, for now. The heart is still doing what the heart does, bearing weight, moving blood, finding the compensation that keeps things going a little longer. You stand in the doorway for a moment. The daughter looks up and you tell her, in the little Italian you have been assembling over 3 years of patience from a neighbourhood where Italian is what people speak, that her mother had a better night. The daughter's face does the thing. You have learned not to look away from this. The thing it does is human and specific and deserves to be received. You move to the next patient. The ward is waking. The worst cases are often the most vivid, the most present, the ones that arrive in your mind on the drive home and that you carry through the days between appointments. They are, in the specific vocabulary of this work, the ones that matter most, not because suffering is noble, because suffering is not noble, it is simply suffering, but because the mattering is proportional to the need, and the need here is very great. The difficult patients have made you a better physician than you would otherwise have been. You did not choose this path. The path was directed at you by the same institutional forces that directed the easier, more remunerative patients toward the physicians who did not need to be convinced they were welcome. But you are on the path, and what it has given you is real, and what you have done with it has also been real, and the accumulation of that reality is a body of work that the pay envelope significantly undervalues. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The AMWA meeting. The American Medical Women's Association meets twice a year, and you have been attending for 6 years since the first year of your practice, since a colleague mentioned it in passing, with a tone that was not exactly an endorsement, but that was enough of a signal to make you look it up and send in the dues and drive to the next meeting, which was held in a hotel ballroom in a city an hour from where you practice, and which was attended by 97 women physicians, which is a number that represents a significant fraction of the women physicians in your region. The meetings are remarkable in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who has not spent the preceding months as the only woman in every professional room they enter. You arrive and the room is full, and everyone in it is a physician, and everyone in it is a woman, and the specific quality of the air changes in a way that is not dramatic, that is in fact very quiet, but that you feel in the body as a form of relief you had not known you were waiting for. The agenda covers things that the other meetings, the county society meetings you cannot attend, the hospital committee meetings you are not on, do not cover. The compensation differential, the hospital privileges problem, the allocation of research funding, the specific ways in which the medical literature systematically underrepresents women patients and therefore systematically under-equips physicians to treat them. These are not marginal topics in the AMWA. They are the agenda. They have been the agenda since 1915. Dr. Marion Fay speaks at the 1953 meeting. She is the president of the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, and she speaks about the pipeline, about the women who want to enter medicine and who are being turned away at the admissions office, about the gap between the qualified applicants and the number admitted, about what the profession is losing in that gap. She speaks without dramatics, in the precise language of someone who has been making this argument for years and who has refined it past the point where emotion is necessary because the facts are sufficient. The room listens. There is no applause at the end, just a murmur that is not quite conversation yet, the sound of a room processing something true that it already knew. At the break, you stand near the coffee service with a woman named Doctor. Helen Taussig, who invented the surgical treatment for blue baby syndrome, who trained under a cardiologist who refused to give her a degree because she was a woman, who developed her technique in part by learning to lip read because her hearing was damaged and the research methods she needed were not made available to her, who received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964 for work she had been doing since the 1940s. She is standing near the coffee urn with a cup in her hand talking to two younger physicians about the aortic arch, and you are close enough to hear, and what you hear is a woman discussing the architecture of the human heart with the specific fluency of someone who has been inside more of them than almost anyone else alive. You do not interrupt this conversation. You finish your coffee and you go back to the ballroom and you sit down for the afternoon session, which covers the question of residency allocation specifically, the pattern by which women who complete medical school are being channeled into certain specialties and away from others, the pattern that is not a written policy and that is therefore very difficult to address through official channels, and the various strategies that women in different cities and different institutions have developed for navigating it. One physician from Chicago describes a hospital where she arranged with a sympathetic chief resident for her to attend surgery cases, unofficially standing near the back, not scrubbing in, observing. She learned what she could from the back of the room. She is describing this not as a hardship, but as a solution, as the specific creative problem-solving that the situation required, and the room receives it with recognition, the nods of people who have invented their own versions of the same workaround. A physician from Alabama describes being the only woman in her county practicing any specialty medicine at all, and the way that her patients, women primarily, in a county where women had not previously had access to a female physician the way they found her, before she had even been in practice a year, through the particular network of women telling women that is older than the medical society and significantly more reliable. She says that her practice filled before she had arranged all her office furniture. The room laughs. It is a real laugh, warm and recognizing. The laugh of people who understand exactly what that means. The AMWA has been fighting for equal pay specifically since the 1940s, when surveys first documented the differential in quantifiable terms. The fight proceeds through letters and position papers and presentations at professional meetings and conversations with hospital administrators and requests to be included in conversations that are currently happening without women in the dog room. It is slow work. It does not produce the changes as quickly as the women making the argument believe it should, because the argument is correct, and the resistance to the argument is not about the argument, but about the rearrangement that accepting the argument would require. You come back from the meeting with something that is difficult to name, but that functions in the body like a resource like you, have been replenished in some way that the daily work, for all its satisfactions, does not quite replenish. You have spent 2 days in a room where your presence was expected, where your competence was assumed, where the problems you are negotiating every day were named accurately and treated as the structural problems they are rather than as personal failures or individual misfortunes. This matters clinically. The physician who has some form of support structure practices medicine differently than the physician who is entirely alone with the daily friction. Not differently in technique or knowledge, the skills are the same regardless, but differently in sustainability. The AMWA meetings are a form of professional maintenance that the other meetings, the ones you cannot attend, provide to your male colleagues as a constant ambient resource. You get it twice a year in a hotel ballroom. You take it seriously, you use it. On the drive home, you are thinking about the conversation near the coffee urn, about the architecture of the aortic arch and the way Dr. Taussig described the specific pressure dynamics in the malformed heart, and you are thinking about a patient you have been puzzling over whose presentation might fit that description. And by the time you pull into your parking space, you have resolved to look more closely at the cardiac study from last Thursday, with these particular dynamics in mind. The AMWA meeting is 2 days long, and produces in you approximately the same refreshment as 2 weeks of normal working life would not produce. This is the mathematics of being the only one in the room, and it has no clean solution, and the solution that exists, the meeting, the network, the room full of women who are also physicians, is imperfect and intermittent and completely necessary, and you will go back in 6 months, and it will be the same room, and it will provide the same thing, and that will be enough to continue. The hospital at 2 in the morning is a different building than the hospital at 2 in the afternoon. The same corridors, the same floors, the same smell of floor wax and antiseptic, but the people in it are different people. The overnight staff, the on-call residents, the occasional family member who has stayed because they could not bear to go home, sitting in the hallway chairs with the particular stillness of people who are waiting for something they cannot speed up. You are on call every third night. This has been your schedule for 4 years, and it has the quality of something that has been fully absorbed, not exactly comfortable, because the interruption of sleep is not comfortable at any level of habituation, but familiar in the way that the body eventually accommodates recurring conditions and learns to function within them rather than against them. You sleep when you can. You wake when the phone rings. You have, over years of this, developed the ability to be clinically functional within approximately 45 seconds of waking, which is not a skill that appears in any professional catalogue, but which is perhaps the most practically important skill you have. Tonight the page comes at 2:17. The ward nurse, a woman named Marge who has been working nights at this hospital for 11 years and who knows the patients better than most of the day physicians. He tells you about bed 7. A man admitted this afternoon for observation. After a syncopal episode, now with chest pain that started approximately 20 minutes ago, and that he initially didn't want to mention because it didn't seem, in his assessment, worth troubling anyone about at this hour. This is the part of the night shift that cannot be taught except by the accumulation of nights like this one. The part where you arrive at the bedside and the situation is what it is: no preparation, no time to review the chart at length, just the patient and the symptoms and the physical examination and the 12 years of training that now have to be sufficient in this moment, at this hour, in this particular configuration of facts. The man in bed 7 is 63, retired, with a face that is doing the thing that faces do when pain is being managed, with a stoicism that was learned in a different era from a different generation's understanding of what men were supposed to communicate about their bodies. The pain is in his chest, radiating to his left arm, and he has been telling himself for 20 minutes that it is probably nothing, that he doesn't want to make a fuss, that Marge has enough to deal with at this hour. He is sweating more than the room temperature explains. You move through the assessment with the efficiency of someone who has done this many times, and who knows what the finding is going to be before the finding arrives. The ECG comes. It says what you already suspected. You call the senior cardiologist on call, a man you have worked with for 3 years who, to his credit, has never made the 2 a.m. phone call feel like an imposition when it is warranted, and you give him the information in the compressed, precise format that 2 a.m. phone calls require. The senior cardiologist arrives. He confirms your assessment. He takes over the case in the official sense, his name on the primary order, his signature on the procedure consent, and you assist, which is the institutional arrangement that the privilege structure requires. You are there. Your assessment was correct. Your reading of the ECG was correct. What happens next will save this man's life in the specific and literal sense that this phrase sometimes has and usually does not, and you were the first person in this chain. By 4 a.m, the man in bed 7 is stable. The cardiologist has gone back to the call room. Marge is updating the chart with the efficiency of someone who has updated a great many charts at 4 a.m. You sit in the nursing station for 5 minutes with a cup of coffee that is not quite hot and that you drink anyway, and you think about the man's face when the pain subsided, the specific quality of relief in it, the particular way the stoicism relaxed, became unnecessary, became simply a man in a bed who was going to be all right. This is the night shift. This is also every shift. The extreme version, the 2 a.m. version, but the same fundamental exchange knowledge applied to a body in distress, the distress relieved by the application, the relief visible in a face. The hour doesn't change the exchange. The hierarchy of the privilege structure doesn't change the exchange. The pay envelope at the end of the month doesn't change it. What it is what it is, and what it is medicine. You have 3 more hours before the day shift arrives. You go back to the call room, which is small and has a window that faces east, and you lie down on the narrow bed, and you are asleep inside 3 minutes, because the body knows when it has time, and it takes the time. The dream, if there is one, does not stay. What stays is the man in bed 7, stable, the ECG normalizing by increments, Marge's handwriting in the chart. The night shift is not where your male colleagues are expected to spend significant portions of their careers. The night shift is where you are expected to spend them, not explicitly, not in any written policy, but in the pattern that emerges from the scheduling over years, where the on-call falls on you with a frequency that is slightly above proportional, where the holiday coverage and the weekend coverage and the 2 in the morning coverage accumulates in a way that reflects the same logic that distributed the difficult patients, the same quiet direction of whatever is undesirable toward whoever is least able to decline it. You do not decline it. You have chosen not to decline it, partly because declining it would require a fight that would cost more than it returned, and partly because the night shift is where medicine happens, in its most essential form, stripped of office hours and appointment schedules, and the administrative texture of the daytime practice, reduced to the patient and the physician and the presenting problem at the moment when the problem is presenting most urgently. It is, in its way, the purest version of what you became a physician to do. The east-facing window begins to brighten before 6. You are awake again, the transition from sleep to waking coming cleanly the way it does after a genuine rest, however short. The hospital is already stirring the breakfast carts, the change of shift, the first of the daytime physicians arriving to take over the cases that have been moving through the night. You hand off the man in bed 7 with a full account of the night's events, complete and precise, the kind of handoff that leaves no question unanswered. Then you go home and sleep for 4 hours and come back in the afternoon for your clinic. This is the rhythm. It continues. The night will come again in 2 days, and you will be here for it, because this is the work. And the work is what you trained for, and you are, in the full sense of the word, a physician at 2 in the morning as much as at 2 in the afternoon, as much when the envelope is thin as when it is sufficient, as much in the call room as in the office at the end of the hallway. The grant applications come back. They come back more often than they go through, and when they go through it is usually for a smaller amount than was requested, and the reasons given are reasons that require a particular kind of reading to understand fully the research questions are not sufficiently novel. The methodology requires refinement. The clinical significance is not clearly demonstrated. These are legitimate scientific critiques, sometimes. They are also, sometimes, the language in which a review committee communicates that the question is not one they find interesting, and the question they find not interesting has been proposed by a woman, and the question is about women's health, and the committee is composed almost entirely of men. The research funding landscape for women physicians in the 1950s has a shape that can be measured. The National Institutes of Health, which begins distributing research grants in the early 1950s, allocates the large majority of its research funding to male investigators. The review committees are mostly male. The senior scientists who write recommendation letters for grant applicants are mostly male, and the recommendation letter in the grant application serves a function that is not strictly about the quality of the proposed research. It is also about the reputation of the person recommending, about the weight of the name attached to the endorsement, and the weight of names is distributed unevenly in this era, in ways that track closely with gender, and yet the research gets done. This is the remarkable thing, the thing that takes a moment to fully register that under these conditions, with these funding structures and these review committees and these recommendation letters, women physicians produce research. They produce it in the margins of their clinical practice, during the hours that are not covered by the clinic schedule, in the evenings after the charts are done. They produce it with smaller budgets that require more creative methodologies. They produce it by accumulating patient data over long periods in the absence of formal study design, by converting their clinical experience into publishable findings through the slow and patient process of careful observation. Dr. Virginia Apgar, who trained in surgery and was told the specialty was too competitive for women, and who therefore became an anesthesiologist, and eventually the head of the anesthesia division at Columbia Presbyterian, invented the Apgar score in 1952. The score, a simple, standardized assessment of a newborn's health, completed at 1 minute and 5 minutes after birth, converting the clinical observation of color and muscle tone and heart rate and respiration and reflexes into a single number, is used in every delivery room in the world today. Millions of newborns. 50 years after the invention, the score is still the score. She developed it on a napkin, according to the story, in a hospital cafeteria in response to a question from a student who asked how you determine whether a newborn needs immediate medical attention. The napkin becomes a paper published in 1953. The paper becomes a standard of care. The standard of care saves an uncountable number of lives across 7 decades. The napkin is now in a museum. Dr. Apgar did not have a research laboratory in 1952. She had her clinical observation, her training in anesthesia, her understanding of neonatal physiology, and a long career of watching what happened to newborns in the delivery room and noticing what the watching told her. The APGAR score is the formalization of that noticing, the conversion of accumulated observation into a replicable, teachable, measurable tool. This is what research looks like when it is done without the laboratory and without the grant, and with the clinical time you have between the other clinical time. Elsewhere in the 1950s, women physicians are doing similar work in the margins. Dr. Layla Denmark, a pediatrician in Georgia who begins practicing in 1928 and does not retire until 2012 at the age of 103, contributes to the development of the pertussis vaccine while maintaining a clinical practice. She does not take insurance. She does not turn away patients who cannot pay. She practices medicine in the way medicine was practiced before it became an industry, and she also contributes to vaccine science, and both of these things are true simultaneously. The research questions that women physicians are most positioned to investigate are, frequently, the questions that the mainstream of the medical literature has not been investigating: the women's health questions, the questions about how diseases present differently in female bodies, the questions about the specific conditions that affect women either exclusively or disproportionately. These questions are, in this era, considered marginal. They are the research equivalent of the difficult patients, the ones nobody else wants, directed toward the physician who is available. The women who investigate them are producing knowledge that the mainstream will eventually absorb, without always fully crediting the source, in the specific way that knowledge absorbed through channels not fully documented tends to lose its attribution. The research on symptom presentation differences in cardiac disease between men and women, the work that would eventually change how cardiologists are trained to recognize heart attacks in female patients. This work is being initiated in the 1950s and 1960s by women physicians who noticed what the textbook descriptions were not covering. The findings will take decades to reach the curriculum. You have your own data. Not organized into a formal study, not funded, not published, but data nonetheless. The data of a practice that has seen primarily women patients for several years, that has tracked the presentations that didn't fit the textbook, and the outcomes that followed from the decisions made in response to those presentations. You have a filing cabinet. A different filing cabinet from the one that holds the society letters full of case notes, organized by presentation type, cross-referenced by outcome. You have been building this without quite deciding to build it, the way that physicians build things when they are paying careful attention to what they see. There is a paper in that filing cabinet. You know this. The way you know things, you have not yet fully articulated. The paper will require time you do not currently have, and a methodology more rigorous than what you have assembled so far, and at least one colleague who can serve as a co-investigator, and whose name on the paper will help the paper be received. You are working toward it in the background of everything else. It will take 5 years, probably. It will be published in a journal that is not the first one you submit it to. It will be read by a number of people who will find it useful, and some of those people will find it useful in their clinical practice, and the clinical practice will affect patients, and the patients will be women with presentations that the textbook currently under-describes. The research that gets done anyway, under these conditions, by these physicians, has a particular quality. It is research that was worth doing badly enough to do without the resources that should have been available. This does not make it better than well-funded research done under optimal conditions. But it makes it real in a way that is worth recognizing the product of someone who found the question important enough to answer with whatever was available, which is perhaps the oldest and most reliable motive for research that has ever existed. Tonight the filing cabinet is closed. The clinic is closed. The hospital is doing what hospitals do after midnight, its own slow work, the overnight version of the relentless forward motion of medicine. Tomorrow, the filing cabinet will open again, and the accumulated case notes will be there, and the paper that is assembling itself, slowly, from the material of a decade of careful observation, will be a little closer to existing. For now, it is enough that the observations were made. The rest will follow, in time. There is a particular kind of patient you remember differently from the others. Not the most complex cases, not the most difficult diagnoses, not the emergencies in the night, though those stay with you too in their way. The ones you remember differently are the ones who knew something, who arrived in the examination room already in possession of a knowledge about their own bodies that the conventional clinical encounter does not always have room for. A woman of 35 comes to your office in 1956. She has been to 3 other physicians in the preceding 2 years and she is carrying a folder. The folder contains notes she has written in a small, precise handwriting about her symptoms, their onset, their duration, their pattern across the months, the things that seem to make them better or worse, the specific quality of each one as she has experienced it from the inside of the experience. She puts the folder on your desk and she waits. The 3 other physicians, she tells you, found the folder remarkable in a way that was not entirely complimentary. One of them told her directly that patients who researched their own conditions were often more of a hindrance than a help, that the symptom pattern she was describing did not fit the disease she had suggested and that her interpretation was therefore not useful. Another reviewed the folder briefly and returned it to her and asked her to describe the symptoms in her own words, which is what the folder was, but the folder apparently did not count. You read the folder. You read it the way you read a chart carefully, sequentially, looking for the pattern that the detail reveals. The handwriting is consistent, the observations specific and temporally anchored, the self-reporting accurate in the ways that self-reporting is accurate and limited in the ways it is limited. And you can see, inside the folder, the shape of something that the 3 previous physicians apparently did not find interesting enough to pursue. The pattern in the folder is consistent with a thyroid condition that is subtle enough in early presentation to be easy to overlook if you are not looking for it, and that is more common in women than in men, and that the medical literature of the mid-1950s discusses with less specificity than it discusses the male typical presentations of more common conditions. You have seen variations on this presentation 4 times in the preceding 3 years. The folder matches what you know. You do the examination, you order the tests. You tell her what you think is happening and what the tests will either confirm or rule out. She listens to this with the attention of someone who has been waiting a long time to be listened to. When you finish, she says, "I thought it was this. I read about it in a medical encyclopedia in the library. I brought the page." She produces, from beneath the clinical notes, a photocopy of a page from a medical encyclopedia that she made at the public library, and the page describes the condition you have just named, and she has underlined several passages in pencil. You tell her she was right, that the notes were useful, that the pattern she tracked made the diagnosis easier, not harder. She looks at you for a moment in the specific way that people look when they have been told something they believed but were beginning to doubt, when the validation arrives after long enough that its arrival carries weight. Then she thanks you in a way that is simple and direct, and that is about the medicine, not about your gender, not about the novelty of sitting across from a woman in a white coat, though you are aware that both of those things are present in the room, but about the fact of being taken seriously in a consultation about her own health. The treatment is straightforward, once the diagnosis is established. Within 6 months she is, by her own account and by the clinical markers, considerably better. She sends you a note at Christmas that year that is 3 sentences, and that you keep in a drawer that contains other notes from other patients, and that you open occasionally in the same way you open the AMWA meeting memory for the resource it provides, the reminder that this is what the work is for. The women who came to your practice in these years often brought with them a history of not being believed. Not uniformly, there were male physicians who listened well and took the presented symptoms seriously and investigated them thoroughly regardless of the gender of the patient. But there was also a current in the culture of medicine that ran against women as reliable witnesses to their own bodies. The hysterical patient, the anxious patient, the patient whose symptoms were psychosomatic, the patient who was making too much of something ordinary, these categories were applied with greater frequency to women than to men, and the application was so embedded in the training and in the literature that it had become effectively invisible, present everywhere as a kind of atmospheric assumption rather than an explicit judgment. You did not escape this entirely. You were trained in the same era by the same instructors from the same textbooks. You have the same atmospheric assumptions in some proportion. What you also have, which some of your colleagues do not have in the same degree, is a practice composed primarily of women patients, which means a practice that has given you a large volume of experience with female presentations of disease, and the large volume has slowly, over years, overwritten some of the assumptions. You have seen too many cases where the symptom the patient described was the accurate description of the thing that was actually happening to maintain a robust skepticism about women as reporters of their own conditions. The folder patient, as you think of her in the private shorthand of memory, is one of dozens who come to you over the years with their own versions of accumulated self-observation. Some of them are wrong about the interpretation. Being wrong about the interpretation is not the same as being wrong about the observation. The symptom is real, even when the hypothesis about its cause is incorrect, and the accurate symptom is the data you have to work with. You listen to the observation, and you bring your own knowledge to the interpretation, and between the two of you, the patient who knows her body and the physician who knows disease, you construct an understanding that is better than either of you could produce alone. This is what the clinical encounter can be. It is not always this. There are patients who do not observe accurately, who magnify or minimize, whose reporting is shaped by fear or denial, or the particular distortions that illness produces in the relationship between sensation and language. You navigate this. It is part of the work. But when the encounter is this, when the patient arrives with her folder, her library photocopy, her 2 years of careful notation, it is among the best versions of what medicine does. The folder is in your filing cabinet, not the one with the society letters, the one with the things worth keeping. The woman is well. The thyroid is managed. The note at Christmas has been in the drawer for 2 years and will be there for many more. The encounter happened and its effects continue to happen. In her body, in the treatment plan, in the way you slightly adjusted your approach to the next patient who arrived with her own version of accumulated knowledge about herself. This is how medicine changes from the inside patient by patient, encounter by encounter, the small adjustments accumulating into something that is eventually different from what it was. There is no official metric for what a physician's work is worth that accounts for everything the work is. The pay envelope is one metric, and it is imprecise in the specific way that all financial measures of human activity are imprecise. It captures some of what the activity is worth in the particular terms the market has assigned, and it misses everything the market has not assigned terms to. What it misses, in your case, in the case of most women physicians practicing in this era, is substantial. It misses the clinical knowledge that came from difficult cases. It misses the research assembled from clinical observation in the absence of formal funding. It misses the network of women patients who found you through the specific channels of women telling women where to go, the network that filled your practice before the official referral structures were made available to you. It misses the night shifts that extended your clinical experience in ways that a less demanding schedule would not have done. It misses the particular quality of attention that was developed, over years, under conditions of chronic institutional friction. The question of what the work is worth is distinct from the question of what the envelope says. You have held both questions simultaneously for so long that the holding of them feels less like tension and more like simply the condition of this life. The two things coexisting without resolution, the way many true things coexist without resolution. The American Medical Women's Association publishes its survey on pay disparity in 1958. The survey covers 800 women physicians practicing across 22 states. The findings are consistent with what you already know from your own envelope, and the envelopes of the colleagues you are close enough to know these things. Women physicians earn, on average, 53 cents for every dollar earned by male physicians in comparable positions. The survey controls for specialty. It controls for hours. It controls for years in practice. The gap persists across all the controls. The survey is published in a journal. It is reviewed by male colleagues at professional meetings with the specific combination of interest and discomfort that structural findings typically produce acknowledged as factual, questioned as to implication, discussed in terms that treat the gap as a puzzle to be explained rather than an injustice to be corrected. The explanation offered most frequently is that women physicians choose lower-paying specialties, choose to work fewer hours, choose to leave practice earlier. The choice framework is comfortable because it locates the explanation in the behavior of the women themselves rather than in the structure of the system. The AMWA's response to the choice framework, offered patiently and repeatedly in every professional venue where the survey is discussed, is that the choices available to women physicians in this era are not the same choices available to men. The specialty choices are constrained by the residency allocation. The hour choices are constrained by the call schedule distribution and the patient panel distribution and the clinic assignment. The career exit choices are influenced by the accumulated cost of practicing in an institution that requires constant negotiation simply to maintain the right to be present. These are not free choices in the sense that the choice framework implies. They are choices made inside a structure that the choice framework prefers not to examine. You are at a professional meeting in 1959 when this discussion happens, in a room you are permitted to attend because the meeting is not a medical society meeting but a hospital continuing education event, and the continuing education events are open. A man in the third row says, earnestly, that he thinks the gap would close if women physicians simply focused more on building their practices and less on the equity question. He is not a malicious person. He is a person who has never had to think about this from the inside, and who therefore cannot quite see what he cannot see. You do not say anything in that moment. You are sitting in the fourth row, and the room is large, and the remark is made to the group rather than to you specifically, and the calculation you make in the 4 seconds between the remark and the potential response is the calculation you have been making in rooms like this one for 15 years. What can be said here, in this room, with this audience, that will advance something rather than simply express something? You decide that what can be said here is not enough to justify the cost of saying it. On the drive home, you say all of it to the interior of the car, which has the advantage of listening without requiring you to perform any particular emotion while you speak. The argument is correct. You have made it in letters and in meetings where it was more likely to be received. The man in the third row will possibly encounter it in some form, through some channel at some point when he is in a position to hear it. The gap he cannot currently see will become visible to him, or it will not. The work continues. This is not a diminished statement. The continuation of the work under these conditions, the insistence on practicing medicine at the highest level you are capable of regardless of what the envelope says, is its own form of argument. The patients who are better because of what you did miss us. Antonelli in her bed, the man in bed 7 stabilized by 3 in the morning, the woman with the folder who finally has a diagnosis, the woman with the cough whose x-ray you ordered, these outcomes are in the world. They happened. The institutional structure that undervalued them did not make them not happen. There is a specific and quiet satisfaction in this. Not the satisfaction of justice, which has not been served. Not the satisfaction of equality, which has not arrived, but the satisfaction of the work itself of knowledge applied correctly to a situation that required it, of a human body returned to some version of function, of the particular moment in the examination room when something that was confusing becomes clear. This satisfaction does not appear in the survey. It does not appear in the gap between the envelopes. It is also real, and it persists, and on the best days, it is what the work is made of. The pay gap will narrow, not quickly, not this decade or entirely the next. It will narrow because women physicians will continue to document it and argue against it, and because the institutional structures that maintain it will be gradually, imperfectly, unevenly dismantled. The AMA will move toward a formal position against gender discrimination in the 1960s. The residency allocation will slowly become less restrictive. The hospital committees will change composition. None of this will happen fast enough for the women practicing in the 1950s, but it will happen, and the women practicing in the 1950s will have been part of why it happens. For now, the envelope is what it is. The work is what it is. You are, in the full and unqualified sense of the word, a physician. The qualification you hold was earned under conditions that did not make the earning easy, and the holding of it has required a sustained effort that the medical system did not account for, and did not compensate, and did not, in its formal documents, acknowledge. None of this changes what it is. It is a fact, like the bones of the body are facts, like the findings of a careful clinical examination are facts. You are a physician. You are doing medicine. The night comes and you do it in the night. The morning comes and you do it in the morning. The envelope comes at the end of the month and you open it and you put it in your bag. Then you go back to the work. The women who practiced medicine in the 1950s left things behind them. Not in the dramatic way of people who intend monuments. In the quiet way of people who did their work and the work persisted after them. They left patients who are alive. This is the most straightforward accounting, and also, in some ways, the most important. The woman with the folder, the man in bed 7, miss us. Antonelli, who went home after a week in the hospital and lived for 7 more years, these are not abstractions. They are people who continued to exist, who had experiences that they would not have had in the absence of the physician who saw them clearly and acted correctly. 7 years of experiences. 7 years of dinners and seasons and the specific weight of a grandchild's hand. The accounting of what medicine does when it works is this particular accounting, and it is very large. They left training. The women who survived residency in the 1950s and who went on to positions at teaching hospitals, and some of them did, despite the obstacles, because the obstacles were significant and not absolute, they trained other physicians. They carried into their teaching the specific clinical knowledge that came from their particular path through medicine, the knowledge of difficult cases, of marginal presentations, of the female patient's experience of disease as the patient had reported it to them in the office at the end of the hallway. The physicians they trained carry some of this forward. The physicians trained by those physicians carry some of it further. By 3 or 4 generations, the lineage is diffuse, but the knowledge it transmitted does not vanish. It is absorbed into the practice of medicine in the way that all accumulated clinical experience is eventually absorbed. They left documentation. The letters to the AMWA, the survey responses, the formal complaints submitted to hospital boards and medical school administrations, the position papers written for professional journals that were sometimes published and sometimes not, this documentation exists. It is in archives. It has been read by historians and by subsequent physicians, and by women who were considering medicine in the 1960s, and who needed to know what the landscape looked like, who were already in that landscape and needed to know they were not alone in it. Dr. Esther Lovejoy spent decades documenting the status of women physicians worldwide. Through the Medical Women's International Association, through her own memoirs and professional writings, through the specific and patient work of making visible what the mainstream of the profession preferred to treat as invisible. Her documentation is one reason we can describe the 1950s with any precision not as a general condition, but as a specific configuration of policies and practices and outcomes, nameable and arguable, subject to change. They left precedent. Each woman physician who practiced in this era and who was there when the next woman arrived demonstrated, through the simple fact of having been there, that it was possible. This is not a small thing. The question of whether something is possible is answered by its having been done, and the having been done changes the nature of the question for the next person who asks it. The woman who applied to medical school in 1955 and found that 6% of the students there were women was looking at a fact that the previous generation had produced by being those students, by insisting on being those students, by driving to hotels in unfamiliar cities twice a year to sit in ballrooms and argue for the right to be those students. The APGAR score is in every delivery room. Dr. Tausig's surgical technique, refined over decades, saved the lives of children who were born with hearts that needed repair. Dr. Lovejoy's documentation made the invisible visible. Dr. Denmark's vaccine work contributed to the elimination of a disease that had killed or permanently damaged a significant fraction of the children it reached. The research from the filing cabinet eventually becomes the paper, and the paper becomes part of the literature, and the literature changes how the next generation of physicians is trained. And the patients, always the patient's individual, specific, not reducible to statistics. The woman who came in on a Tuesday in November with a cough that had persisted for 6 weeks, and a husband who told her it was nothing. She got a physician who sat down. She got an examination and an order for an X-ray and a follow-up appointment and a treatment plan that worked. She got years. The years are not in any data set. They happened anyway. The story of women physicians in the 1950s is not a story of triumph over adversity in the way that stories prefer their endings. It is a story of steady work under difficult conditions, of the pay gap and the hospital privileges problem and the society exclusion and the late calls and the worst cases, and also of the work itself, which was real and which mattered, and which did not require the validation of the structures around it in order to be what it was. The women who lived this story did not, mostly, experience it as historic. They experienced it as their workday, the chart to review, the patient to see, the phone ringing at 2:17, the envelope at the end of the month. They were physicians practicing medicine in the specific institutional context of 1950s America, negotiating that context with the tools available to them, doing the work in the spaces the context permitted, and sometimes in the spaces it did not technically permit, but that they occupied anyway because the patients were there, and the patients needed what they had. This is what it looks like from the inside of an era. Not the sweeping assessment, not the historical overview, but the Tuesday in November, the cup of coffee at 4 in the morning that is not quite hot, the folder with the precise handwriting, the man who called you a nurse and then called you doctor by the end of the appointment. The small and specific texture of a life that was, in its way, exceptional, and that was also simply a life, the only life available, the one that was happening, the one inside which the work was done. Let it settle now. Let the offices and the wards and the call rooms soften and blur. The work is done for tonight. The patients are resting. Mrs. Antonelli is sleeping in her bed in the ward. The man in bed 7 has a normal ECG. The woman with the folder has a prescription and a follow-up appointment and a diagnosis that is correct. The filing cabinet is closed. The envelope is in the bag. This is what was left behind. This is what the work made. It is, in the accounting that matters, sufficient not equal to what was deserved, not just, not what should have been, but real and permanent. And in the world, the decade ends. Not dramatically, it does not have a clear boundary. 1,959, becoming 1,960 in the same incremental way that all time moves, each day indistinguishable from the one before it, until enough of them have accumulated to constitute a change that can be named and looked back on. The 1950s end. The 1960s begin. The hospital is still there. The office at the end of the hallway is still there. The filing cabinet, both of them, is still there. What changes is slow and cumulative and does not announce itself as change until later, when it is possible to measure from a distance. The AMA, in 1965, adopts a position against gender discrimination in medical education and practice. Some state medical societies begin admitting women without requiring the particular negotiations that the previous decade required. The hospital privilege structure starts, in some institutions, to reform not because the men in the committees have had a change of heart, but because the external pressure, accumulated through a decade of documented exclusion, has reached a level that produces some movement. The pay gap narrows, slowly, across the 1960s and into the 1970s. It does not close. It narrows. In 2020, there is still a pay gap between male and female physicians in the United States. It is smaller than it was in 1955. It is not gone. The narrowing is the work of generations of women physicians and the advocacy organizations and the institutional reforms and the documentation that made the invisible, visible, and arguable. The remaining gap is the work of the next generation. This is how structural change works, not as resolution but as direction, not as arrival but as movement. The women who practiced in the 1950s are, by the time the larger movement of change becomes visible, mostly retired. Some of them write about what it was like. The memoirs are careful and specific, the memories intact in the way that medical memories tend to be intact. The cases more vivid than the calendar dates, the patients more present than the abstract conditions of the profession. They remember the folder and the man in bed 7, and Mrs. Antonelli more reliably than they remember the year the survey was published. This makes sense. The patients are the material of the work. 2. The institutional conditions are the weather in which the work happens. Significant, formative, occasionally severe, but weather, not the thing itself. The thing itself is always the patient and the physician, and the exchange between them, the offering of knowledge to a person who needs it, the reduction of confusion and the extension of possibility. That is what medicine does when it works. The weather changes. The thing itself persists. In the long quiet of a career's end, the evening after the last patient, the office packed into boxes, the diplomas taken off the wall and wrapped in newspaper, there is a particular quality of stillness. The things you could not change are visible now, from here, as the things you could not change, not as failures. As the shape of the era, the conditions inside which the work happened, the weather, what you could change you changed, within the limits of what you had. The limits were substantial. The changes were also substantial. Both things are true. The women who sit in this quiet, at the end of these careers, have been physicians for 30 or 40 years. They have seen thousands of patients. They have made correct diagnoses that were not made before them, and incorrect diagnoses that subsequent examination corrected, and diagnoses that were close enough to serve the purpose, and diagnoses that were brilliant, and diagnoses that were routine, and diagnoses that in retrospect were the thing that made the difference. They have done this in the night and in the morning and on holidays and in the margins of everything else. The APGAR score has been given to millions of newborns by the time the women of the 1950s retire. The blue baby surgery has saved tens of thousands of children. The pertussis vaccine has reduced the disease burden across a generation. The research from the filing cabinet has found its way, in various forms through various channels, into the medical literature that trains the next generation of physicians. Some of this is attributed. Some of it is simply absorbed, the way knowledge is absorbed into the general understanding, becoming eventually what everyone knows, losing the specific origin as it becomes common. The office at the end of the hallway will be reassigned to someone else. The plant will not survive the transition, or it will be taken home, or it will go with a colleague who remembers it and wants to maintain the continuity. The diplomas will go on the wall of a study, or a home office, or a box in a closet. The filing cabinets, both of them, will be cleared, most of the papers shredded as regulations require, the things worth keeping transferred elsewhere. What does not go into the boxes is the accumulated experience, the clinical knowledge, and the specific kind of attention and the understanding of the gap between what the institution says it is and what it actually is, and the patience for the long, slow work of making those two things less, different. This does not go into boxes because it is not in the filing cabinet. It is in the physician, and the physician carried it forward into every examination room and every call night and every AMWA meeting, and it dispersed from there into the patients who are well and the physicians who were trained, and the documentation that made the visible more visible. Rest now. The decade is over. The career is over, or it is continuing, or it is the middle of the night in the middle of the 1950s, and you are in the call room looking at the ceiling while the hospital does its slow overnight work around you. The time of the story is flexible. The ward is quiet. Mrs. Antonelli is breathing. The morning is coming, at the pace that mornings come. You have done what you came to do. The work is real. The patients are real. The knowledge you brought to the encounter between them is real, and it was brought honestly, and it was applied with the full seriousness that the work deserves, and the world is slightly different in consequence. This is sufficient. This is, in the clearest accounting, exactly sufficient. The hospital settles around you. The floors, the fluorescent lights now dark or dim, the smell of floor wax and antiseptic that you have breathed for so long it has become simply the smell of work, of the particular work that is yours. The window at the east end of the ward has a faint lightening at its edge. Not dawn yet, the long quiet before dawn, the still point of the hospital's night. Let it hold you. Let the ward hold you, and the stillness hold you, and the morning wait at the edge of the window for a little while longer. There is nothing that requires your attention right now. The patients are resting. You have done what was needed. The filing cabinet is closed. The work continues, will continue, is already continuing in the slow and quiet way that all real work continues, not with drama, not with announcement, but steadily, in the dark, building toward the morning. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. The story is finished now. The hospital at the end of the night, the ward with its sleeping patients, the office at the end of the hallway, dark, the diplomas on the wall in the dark, the plant on the windowsill, the filing cabinet closed, the envelope in the bag. These women were physicians. They were physicians in the full and unqualified sense, trained, competent, dedicated to their work and to the patients their work served. They practiced medicine in a decade that compensated them at half the rate of their male colleagues for the same degree, the same hours, the same decisions made in the same fluorescent light. They practiced it anyway. They practiced it in the night and in the morning and in the office, too small, and in the clinic nobody else wanted, and in the call room with the east-facing window, and in the hotel ballrooms twice a year where the room was full and everyone in it was a physician, and everyone in it was a woman. The world is different because they were in it. Not transformed. The transformation is still ongoing, still incomplete but different, measurably and permanently different, in the specific ways that happen when a large number of people do their work carefully and honestly over a long period of time in conditions that do not make the work easy. Let the hospital go quiet now. Let the ward settle. Let the breathing of the sleeping patients fill the long room like a tide, slow and even, the sound of bodies resting in the specific trust that the hospital at night makes possible, the trust that someone is watching, that the knowledge is present in the building, that the thing that went wrong has been or is being addressed by someone who knows how to address it. You know how to address it. You are here. The night is ending. The east window brightens, very slowly, in the particular way that dawn comes to hospital wards, not as a sunrise you witness, but as a gradual lifting of darkness, a slow return of objects from the grey, the shapes of the beds becoming distinct, the faces of the sleeping patients becoming visible. Rest now. Wherever you are, let the weight of the day release from the shoulders, from the hands, from the careful posture that the waking hours require. Let the breathing slow. Let the thoughts soften and lose their edges and become something gentler, less definite, the kind of thinking that happens at the border of sleep. The ward is quiet. The filing cabinet is closed. The morning is coming slowly. You do not have to go to meet it. It will arrive when it arrives, and you will be rested when it does, and the work will be there, and you will be ready. Sleep now. Sleep well. The story continues tomorrow, as it has always continued, in the offices and the wards and the call rooms and the ballrooms of hotels, in the hands and the minds of the women who kept doing the work. The morning will come. The work will be there. Tonight is for rest. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.